used to think the worst thing in life was losing your husband. I was wrong. The worst thing is opening a box to find his ashes, and a handwritten letter from his mistress. I had to read it 3 times before I believed it, ink in an elegant, serpentine blue, scented faintly of lilies. Lilies. Arthur always said they were too sentimental. She was sorry. For the 15-year affair. For the sadness Arthur apparently carried through our marriage. For the garden he never planted for me. He'd asked her to send me his ashes. He'd asked her to apologize. A man who lived 68 years, married for 43. And in the end, it was his lover who spoke the final words to his wife. I sat there for a long time. I didn't read the letter again. I didn't touch the polished box. The late sun streamed through the stained glass window, catching the corner of the table where last year's Christmas cards still stood. The house was quiet. No sound of Arthur turning pages. No scent of his pipe lingering in the hall. Everything was the same, and none of it felt real. I used to think silence was the hardest thing. But no. What's harder is hearing the truth echo in familiar walls. Then I noticed it. A cream-colored envelope, nearly invisible, tucked just beneath the edge of the box. Handwritten. Addressed to me. The lily scent drifted up again, light and cloying. I opened the letter. The polished wooden box sat on Eleanor Vance's mahogany hall table, an alien presence radiating a quiet, unbearable heat where Christmas cards usually offered their seasonal cheer. Arthur's ashes. And with them, as the sober-suited man had quietly indicated, a personal correspondence. It wasn't just the finality of the urn, its compact, terrible neatness, that stole the air from her lungs. It was the foreknowledge of that other item, the letter penned by his mistress, a fact that had settled like ice in her veins even before she fully processed the urn itself. For a long moment, she could only stare at the box, the weight of that unseen message pressing down on her, a silent testament to a life she hadn't known. Then, her gaze, drawn by an almost unwilling fascination, focused on what she hadn't allowed herself to truly acknowledge in her initial shock, a cream-colored envelope, nearly invisible, tucked just beneath the edge of the box where the lid met the base. It was addressed to Mrs. Eleanor Vance in an exquisite, flowing script that was achingly beautiful and utterly, terrifyingly unfamiliar. The lily scent, faint and cloying, a scent Arthur had always professed to dislike, drifted up as if confirming its origin, its terrible intimacy. Inside, a confession waited. An apology, penned by a woman named Vivienne LaRoche. His mistress, the words seemed to whisper from the expensive paper. 15 years. The syllables detached themselves, hovering like wasps in the cold March sunroom light, each one a separate sting. 15 years of early trains, late dinners, of a life Eleanor had believed, with the fierce, quiet pride of a meticulous woman, that she shared, that she understood. The garden he never planted for her, Vivian's letter mentioned, was one of his regrets. How could this stranger know of such a deeply buried, personal ache? Only an hour ago, this Tuesday had been unfolding with the predictability of a well-tended clock. Tea at 7, black, no sugar, brewed for precisely 4 minutes. The Hadleyville Gazette, front to back, allowing an extra 5 for the crossword. She'd even made a mental note to finally look up the name of the small, darting bird that frequented the empty feeder outside the kitchen window, the one Arthur had always meant to fill but never had. Then, the purr of the unfamiliar sedan, the sober-suited man, the box. And now this. This letter. Her fingers, usually so adept at the delicate, patient work of restoring antique lace for the church bazaars, trembled as she forced herself to read on. Dear Mrs. Vance, Vivienne LaRoche had written, her sorrow and indelicacy beautifully, cruelly expressed. Arthur and I, we shared a connection. He spoke of you, infrequently, but always with a respect I now see was laced with a sadness, a distance. He was not, perhaps, the man you fully knew, or perhaps, the man he allowed himself to be with you. In his final weeks, he asked me to ensure his ashes reached you. And he asked me to tell you, he was sorry. For the garden. For so many things unspoken. Sorry. Arthur, through this ghost woman, was sorry. For the garden. The bitter irony was a taste in Eleanor's mouth, like metallic dust. All those years, all those quiet dinners and neatly kept accounts of their life together, and this was his final ledger. An apology delivered by his mistress, nestled beside his ashes. The order Eleanor had so carefully constructed around herself, her life, her memories of him, fractured then dissolved, leaving her standing in the ruins, the phantom scent of lilies heavy in the cold, unblinking light. Sleep offered no refuge. Eleanor lay rigid in the four-poster bed she had shared with Arthur for what now felt like a lifetime built on half-truths. Vivian's words, elegant and devastating, replayed themselves in the darkness, each syllable a small, sharp stone dropped into the well of her memory. 15 years. Solace. He spoke of you, with a sadness. What sadness? The sadness of a man leading a double life? Or the sadness of a man who couldn't find what he needed in the meticulously ordered life she had so diligently maintained? The questions, unbidden and unwelcome, circled like vultures. The grandfather clock in the hall, a wedding gift from Arthur's parents, ticked with its usual measured cadence, each talk a dismissive counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of her heart. Its familiar chime, usually a comfort, now seemed to mark the passing of hollow hours, empty years. She rose before dawn, the habit of decades too ingrained to break, but the sun, when it finally seeped through the lace curtains of her bedroom, felt intrusive, too bright for the shadowed landscape of her thoughts. Her home, once a sanctuary of predictability, now seemed to whisper with secrets. The worn velvet armchair where Arthur read his financial papers, the faint indentations still visible, the scent of his pipe tobacco lingering in the study drapes, the precise alignment of books on his shelves, all these ordinary things were now overlaid with a faint, nauseating film of deceit. Her son, Robert, called precisely at 9, as he did every Tuesday. His voice, clear and pragmatic from his law office 2 states away, was a jarring intrusion of normalcy. "Everything all right, Mom?" "Fine, dear," Eleanor heard herself say, her own voice a stranger's, thin and brittle. "Just a bit tired." She listened to him speak of his latest case, of his children's school achievements, the carefully curated highlights of a successful life. She offered the usual responses, the maternal nods across the miles. The urn sat on the sunroom table. Vivian's letter lay beside it. She said nothing of either. How could she? How could she dismantle the edifice of their family, of Arthur's respectable memory, with such a tawdry, common revelation? The unspoken thing between them, her grief, his carefully managed concern, remained a gentle rift, wider now than she could have imagined. "Give my love to Sarah and the children," she said, and hung up, the silence rushing back in, more absolute than before. Later, driven by an impulse she didn't examine, she found herself in the damp, chilly mudroom off the kitchen, searching through a jumble of discarded garden tools and clay pots. There, at the back of a dusty shelf, wrapped in yellowed newspaper, was the rosebush cutting. Arthur had brought it home from a nursery tour 6 springs ago. A Queen Elizabeth, he'd announced. "The best. We'll plant it in the new garden, Ellie. Our anniversary rose." The new garden had remained a patch of stubborn couch grass and defiant dandelions. The cutting, he'd insisted, needed to acclimate. He'd set it in a bucket of water, then promptly forgotten it. She had been the one to transfer it to damp peat moss, tucking it away on this shelf, a small, private act of hope, or perhaps, of quiet defiance against his chronic neglect of such promises. She unwrapped it carefully. Astonishingly, after all this time, a tiny, pale green nub of life pushed through the dry, gray bark. It was still viable. Eleanor carried the cutting into the sunroom, the scent of dormant earth clinging to its roots. She placed it on the table beside Arthur's ashes and Vivian's elegant, poisonous letter. 3 starkly different testaments to a life. One, a man's reduced essence; another, a stranger's beautifully penned confession; the third, a stubborn, almost foolish speck of life, refusing to die. She stared out at the barren patch of ground beyond the window, the place Arthur had always designated for their roses. The wind whipped the bare branches of the lilac. For years, that patch had been a quiet symbol of his benign neglect, of shared dreams deferred and then forgotten. Now, it felt like something else, a challenge. Or perhaps, an invitation. A place where something, finally, might be brought to life on her own terms. Her mind, a turmoil of grief and betrayal and a bewildering, nascent anger, found a single, hard point of focus in that small, tenacious shoot of green. The cream-colored envelope lay where she'd left it, an elegant scar on the sunroom's morning calm. Days had passed since its arrival, each one a slow turning of the same jagged thoughts. Eleanor found herself rereading Vivian's letter not for new information, its devastating core was seared into her, but for the spaces between the lines, for the shape of the woman who had penned them. Vivian had written of Arthur's unexpressed burdens, of a sadness and a distance even within their illicit solace. He was not, perhaps, the man you fully knew, or perhaps, the man he allowed himself to be with you. A memory, sharp and unwelcome as a shard of glass, surfaced. Years ago, perhaps 10, on a rare Sunday when Arthur wasn't golfing or engrossed in his market reports, she'd tentatively shown him a sketch she'd made, a design for the rose garden they'd once spoken of so wistfully. Not a professional blueprint, just a hopeful imagining on a piece of foolscap. Arthur had glanced at it, a brief, distracted frown. Ambitious, Ellie, he'd murmured, already turning back to his newspaper. Perhaps too much sun in that corner. And roses are a devil to maintain. His disinterest hadn't been unkind, merely complete. It was the sort of casual dismissal she'd learned to absorb, to smooth over, like a wrinkle in a well-kept linen tablecloth. Her own small creative leanings, like the soft lavender she'd once suggested for the kitchen walls only to be gently steered towards a sensible beige by Arthur, now felt like tiny, extinguished sparks she hadn't realized she still mourned. But Vivian's Arthur, the man in the letter, seemed to have words for his feelings, for regret. Had he shown this other woman a vulnerability he'd never offered her, his wife of 4 decades? The thought was a fresh stab, igniting a slow burn of anger that was, surprisingly, less directed at Vivian and more at the ghost of Arthur himself. An anger mixed with a profound, weary sorrow for the woman she had been, the one who had settled for emotional crumbs, mistaking them for a modest meal. The rose cutting sat on the windowsill, its pale nub of green infinitesimally larger, or so she imagined. It seemed to mock her paralysis, this tiny speck of life insisting on its purpose while she, Eleanor, drifted in a fog of posthumous betrayals. Suddenly, something within her snapped. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the clean, decisive break of an old, brittle twig. Enough. She stood, leaving her half-eaten toast, the tea cooling in its china cup. She strode to the hall closet, pulling out Arthur's old gardening boots, too big for her, but sturdy, and a pair of his stiff, canvas gloves. She hadn't consciously decided what she was doing, not until she found herself standing in the aisle of Hadley's hardware, the scent of fertilizer and new plastic sharp in her nostrils. She bought a sturdy spade, a cultivator with menacing tines, and 3 large bags of enriched garden soil. Mr. Hadley, who'd known Arthur for 50 years, raised a curious eyebrow. Taking up a new hobby, Eleanor? Something like that, Joe, she replied, her voice firm, surprising even herself. Back home, she surveyed the barren patch. It was a mess of impacted clay, stubborn weeds whose names she didn't know, and a scattering of frost-heaved stones. The task seemed monumental, ridiculous. For a moment, the familiar wave of Arthur's implied dismissal washed over her, ambitious Ellie. Too much for you. She shoved the spade into the unyielding earth. The jolt shot up her arms. It was hard. Her back protested with every thrust, her breath came in ragged gasps, and the late March wind seemed determined to steal the warmth from her bones. Her carefully manicured nails, a small vanity she'd always maintained, were soon chipped and caked with dirt. Perspiration trickled down her temples. She worked with a kind of grim, focused fury. Each spadeful of resistant clay felt like excavating a layer of old grief. Each uprooted weed, its tenacious roots finally yielding, was a small, savage victory over years of quiet suppression. This wasn't about Arthur's memory, not anymore. This wasn't even about Vivian's unexpected letter. This was about the raw, unyielding earth beneath her feet and the equally raw, unyielding ache within her. And as she worked, alone in the stark March light, a different kind of order began to emerge, not one of neat labels and predictable sequences, but the brutal, honest order of effort, of breaking ground. Eleanor worked. Day after day, as March grudgingly gave way to a damp, hesitant April, she wrestled with the stubborn earth. The news of her sudden, fervent gardening had, as news does in a town like Hadleyville, percolated through the community with the speed of spilt coffee. Eleanor Vance is digging up Arthur's old rose bed like a woman possessed, Mrs. Henderson from the library had remarked to Betty at the bakery, a comment Betty dutifully relayed to Eleanor when she stopped in for her usual rye loaf. Eleanor had merely nodded, offering no explanation. Her grief, her anger, her bewildering new purpose, these were private things, not for public consumption or neighborly dissection. Still, the town watched. Mrs. Gable, whose prize-winning dahlias were the envy of the Hadleyville Garden Club and who served as a keeper of every bloom and blight in a 3-block radius, was the first to make an overt approach. She appeared at Eleanor's low stone fence one blustery afternoon, her gardening apron already smudged, a trowel in hand as if by permanent extension. "Eleanor, dear," she called, her voice carrying a blend of genuine curiosity and well-honed neighborly concern. "Quite the project you've taken on. Arthur never got around to that patch, did he? Always said his back wasn't up to it after that unpleasantness with the guttering." Eleanor, kneeling by a newly turned patch of soil, her face smudged with earth, merely straightened, wiping a stray strand of hair from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand. Her practiced composure was intact, but there was a new, quiet firmness in her gaze, a hint of focused will. "It needed doing, Agnes." Indeed, Mrs. Gable peered more closely. "Are those daylilies you're putting in?" Arthur was always one for the grandiflora roses, you know. The dramatic ones. "I prefer things that ask for less and give more," Eleanor said, her voice even, and turned back to her work, effectively ending the exchange. She felt a small, perverse satisfaction in Agnes Gable's slightly miffed retreat. The Queen Elizabeth rose cutting, Arthur's forgotten promise, was her next task. This felt different, more significant than the sturdy perennials she'd wrestled into the ground. She chose a spot where the morning sun would catch it, sheltered from the harshest winds by the old lilac. As she carefully loosened the peat moss from its meager roots, she performed the task with a ritualistic precision. She recalled, with a pang of unwelcome clarity, Arthur's voice as he'd presented the cutting, a Queen Elizabeth Ellie. Named for a strong woman. The irony was not lost on her now. He had admired strength in names, in distant figures, yet had so often seemed to overlook or perhaps even subtly undermine her own. The charged object pulsed with these complex, layered memories. As she firmed the soil around its base, Mrs. Henderson from the library walked by, offering a brief, hesitant wave. Eleanor nodded back, aware of the eyes, the whispers, the quiet speculation that undoubtedly followed her mud-stained progress. There were days when the sheer physical effort, combined with the weight of her internal turmoil, felt overwhelming. One particularly bleak afternoon, after struggling for an hour to dislodge a deeply embedded rock, she sank onto the damp earth, her shoulders aching, her spirit flagging. "Ambitious Ellie," Arthur's voice echoed in her memory, laced with that familiar, gentle condescension. "Too much for you." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps this whole endeavor was a fool's errand, a ridiculous gesture against an unchangeable past. A cold drizzle began to fall, plastering her hair to her temples, each drop a tiny punctuation mark of defeat. And then, as she sat there, wallowing in a gray fog of self-doubt, her gaze fell upon a small patch of ground near the old, cracked flagstone path. Pushing through a fissure, tiny and defiant, was a cluster of forget-me-nots, their impossibly blue blossoms luminous against the dull earth. They hadn't been planted there, they were volunteers, weeds to some, survivors to others. They asked for nothing, yet here they were, a splash of vivid, unbidden beauty. Eleanor stared at them for a long moment. A weed flower, perhaps. Or perhaps, a tiny, fierce affirmation. She took a deep, ragged breath, the scent of damp earth and nascent spring filling her lungs. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed herself to her feet. Her muscles screamed in protest, but the image of those resilient blue flowers remained. She picked up her spade. The drizzle softened, became almost a mist. And Eleanor Vance, who the town thought was perhaps losing her sensible mind, continued to dig. Weeks bled into a warmer, greener May. The garden, no longer a hostile patch of clay, began to show the hesitant outlines of Eleanor's vision. Rows of sturdy perennials, catmint, salvia, Shasta daisies, plants chosen for their resilience and unpretentious charm rather than the flamboyant, prize-winning roses Arthur might have favored, were taking root. The Queen Elizabeth rose, surprisingly, sported several new, vigorous shoots. As Eleanor knelt, teasing out a stubborn dandelion from beside a clump of newly planted lavender, her trowel struck something hard. Not a stone, but something smoother, more deliberate in its resistance. Brushing away the loamy soil, she unearthed a small, heart-shaped locket, tarnished silver, its chain long since corroded. It was not hers. It must have belonged to a previous inhabitant of their century-old house, lost and forgotten decades ago. She turned it over in her palm, the cool metal a small, dense weight of unknown history. Whose hopes, whose promises, lay buried here? The thought, unexpected and poignant, sent a shiver through her, a sense of lives layered upon lives, each with its own unspoken sorrows and joys. The slow, repetitive work of planting, weeding, and watering had become a kind of meditation. It loosened memories, not in a flood, but in small, iridescent bubbles that rose to the surface of her consciousness. She recalled Arthur, not just the distant, preoccupied husband of recent years, but the younger man who had once, on an impromptu trip to the coast, brought back pockets full of sea glass, his eyes bright with a boyish enthusiasm she'd almost forgotten. He'd laughed when she asked what he'd do with it all. Just look at it, Ellie. Just for the pleasure of it. Where had that man gone? Or, a more difficult question began to form, how much of his retreat had been his own doing, and how much her own unyielding expectation of a certain kind of marital order. He had, she remembered with a sudden clarity, fixed Mrs. Henderson's broken gate with patient skill, a task he'd endlessly deferred at their own home. It wasn't, perhaps, simple malice or neglect in his case, but a perplexing, inconsistent capacity for care, a map of emotional engagement she had never fully deciphered. One afternoon, she found it, the large, smooth, gray stone Arthur had carried up from a Narragansett beach nearly 30 years prior. Perfect for the edge of the rose garden, he declared, depositing it by the shed where it had lain, moss-gathering and ignored ever since. A symbol, like so many others, of good intentions paving a road to nowhere in particular. She'd always felt a faint irritation looking at it, another item on an endless list of things Arthur meant to do. Now, however, surveying the nascent garden, her garden, a different impulse arose. With considerable effort, she maneuvered the heavy stone, not to the edge where he'd vaguely intended it for a non-existent rose bed, but to a central spot beneath the newly leafing lilac, a place where it would catch the dappled sunlight. It looked right. Solid. A piece of their shared past, yes, but placed now by her hand, integrated into her design. It was an act of quiet reclaiming, an acknowledgement that not all memories were to be discarded, but recontextualized. That evening, exhaustion settling deep in her bones, she found herself rereading Vivian's letter. The refined script, the scent of lilies still faintly clinging to the paper. He found a different kind of solace with me. The words no longer solely pricked with the sting of betrayal. A new, tentative question formed. What if Arthur, for all his perceived New England reserve, had craved an emotional directness, a form of intimate expression that Eleanor, in her own quiet, ordered way, had never quite offered or perhaps even recognized as a need? Vivian had been bold enough to write this letter, to speak of feelings Arthur himself had seemingly kept locked away from his wife. Was there a courage there Eleanor had mistaken for audacity? It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was something smaller, more fragile, a pinprick of uncomfortable, unsettling empathy for the woman who had signed her name Vivienne LaRoche. Eleanor folded the letter carefully. She looked out at her emerging garden, dark now under a sky pricked with early stars. The shapes of her newly planted hopes were indistinct, shadowed. But they were there. Her hands ached. Her back was stiff. But beneath the weariness, a new feeling stirred, unfamiliar and tentative, a quiet sense of her own, enduring capacity. Late summer breathed a warm, golden haze over Hadleyville. Eleanor's garden, once a battlefield of stubborn clay and defiant weeds, was now a tapestry of textured greens, punctuated by the muted purples of salvia, the cheerful yellows of coreopsis, and the brave, singular blooms of the Queen Elizabeth rose. It was, she admitted to herself, imperfect. Some plants thrived, others sulked. Patches remained a little wild, where she'd allowed determined wildflowers to intermingle with her chosen perennials. But it was alive, breathing with a quiet energy that was entirely its own, and entirely hers. Her mornings now began not with the ghosts of old routines, but with a cup of coffee, carried out to a weathered wooden bench she'd placed beneath the lilac. From here, she could see the whole of her creation. One Saturday, the air sweet with the scent of phlox, a small head bobbed above her low fence. Leo, the neighbor's grandson, a boy of perhaps 7 with serious eyes and a permanent grass stain on one knee, pointed a small finger. "That one's fuzzy," he declared, indicating a lamb's ear plant. Eleanor, who a year ago might have offered a polite, distant smile and retreated indoors, found herself beckoning him closer. "It is, isn't it? And very soft. Would you like to touch it?" Leo scrambled under a loose picket, his gaze wide with curiosity. He stroked the lamb's ear with a reverent finger. Eleanor watched him, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the morning sun. She showed him a ladybug on a zinnia stem, the delicate tracery of a spider's web kissed between 2 tomato plants. She gave him a small, slightly misshapen cherry tomato, warm from the vine, which he popped into his mouth with a sound of pure delight. The interaction was fleeting, simple. When his grandmother called him, he scampered off with a shy, "Thank you, Mrs. Vance." But as Eleanor watched him go, she felt a shift within her, profound and quiet. This garden, born of shock and sorrow, had become something more. It was not a monument to Arthur's neglect, nor a defiant statement to Vivienne's memory. It was simply a place of gentle life, capable of offering a moment of uncomplicated joy to a child. This was her internal climax, recognizing this new, open-hearted capacity within herself. Robert visited a few weeks later, on his way to a conference further north. He stood awkwardly at the edge of the patio, surveying the transformation. The last time he'd seen this patch, it was mostly weeds. "The garden looks good, Mom," he said finally, his lawyerly precision softened by a note of surprise, perhaps even grudging admiration. He walked among the paths she'd laid with flat fieldstones. "You always did have a green thumb, hidden away." He paused by the Queen Elizabeth rose, its petals a delicate shell pink. He touched one gently. He would have liked this one. Then, his gaze fell on the large, smooth gray stone beneath the lilac. Eleanor saw a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, recognition? Regret? "It suits the spot," was all he said. But it was enough. He stayed for lunch, and for the first time in years, their conversation felt less like a navigation of minefields and more like talk. Dusk was settling, painting the garden in hues of lavender and old gold. Eleanor sat on her bench, the scent of damp earth and night-blooming stock perfuming the air. The anger, the raw betrayal that had fueled her initial efforts, had long since softened, composted into the rich soil of understanding. Arthur, Vivienne, they were ghosts, yes, but no longer malevolent. They were simply part of the complex, tangled humus from which this new piece had grown. She thought of Vivienne's letter, now tucked away in a drawer with Arthur's few remaining papers. Perhaps Vivienne, too, had sought solace in a garden. Perhaps all acts of creation, however small, were quiet answers to life's unanswerable sorrows. The pain of Arthur's deceptions hadn't vanished entirely. It was a scar, a thinned place in the fabric of her memory. But scars, she was learning, were not just evidence of wounds, but of healing. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the lilac. She closed her eyes, listening to the evening sounds of Hadleyville, a distant dog bark, the laughter of children from a nearby yard, the chime of the town clock, no longer accusatory, but simply marking time. Her time. This garden was not the one they had never had. It was the one she had made. And in its imperfect, resilient beauty, Eleanor Vance finally felt, quite simply, at home within herself. And so, from the ashes of one promise, another kind of beauty took root. What unplanted gardens lie waiting in your own life, perhaps needing only a decision, a first turning of the soil? Share your thoughts, and perhaps your own stories of unexpected growth, in the quiet spaces below.